I've never been introduced as a distinguished professor, so I will use the opportunity for 5 minutes to speak like a professor and go through my thoughts, which I changed last night. 4 o'clock in the morning, I changed the entire plan for speaking, and we'll proceed accordingly. I think what I wanted to start off with was really my background is education and gender, and that's been my specialization for the last 20, 25 years. And I thought from listening yesterday, I should really redefine in this whole mode of looking at change and how life changes. They're also changing definitions. When it comes to education, for me, education is not just basic education. Education is informal education. It's non-formal education, it's technical training and education, it's literacy programs, it's capacity development. So as an academic, as a practitioner, as a policymaker, I have used that umbrella to define my education programs and strategies. And on gender, gender is not just girls, it's girls and boys. If you're looking at trafficking issues in India, bonded labor, it's boys and girls. In Sri Lanka, if you're looking at the coastal areas, there are more boys who are in the sex market than girls. So it's very context-driven, but too often a gender lens is looking at girls and girls' access and girls' equity, and forgetting that there are so many times which boys are the victims, boys are marginalized, and boys need to be supported. So my gender lens again, and in my presentation, will speak about the two. It also includes social inclusion. There's so many minority populations. So that's the professor part of me, giving you definitions before I speak. I want to talk also about relevance. When I was doing my PhD program long time ago, I never planned on working in gender. I went back to my school in West Africa, in Ghana, talked to my principals who are still there, said, I want to work on education, what should I do? And the recommendation was, look at what accounts for girls dropping out of school. So my findings were, contrary to many of the feminist explanations at that time, it wasn't about customary attitudes. It is about rational economic choice, that girls and their parents left school after they got literate and numerate to go into the informal sector and get jobs, because they could stay in basic education, finish the cycle, get jobs as teachers, but would end up having to go into the informal sector at night to earn a living. So that framed my experience, my interventions as I moved forward. I saw this when I moved from academia into policy. In Afghanistan, I would see girls out of school, I would see boys out of school, I would see the relevance of education. You couldn't just tell a 15-year-old boy in Afghanistan to go back to school. You'd have to figure out what kind of workforce program could you provide to them. So I worked with a commander in the Kunar province to provide skills and training linking to jobs, where you'd end up having a pay of $5 a day, as opposed to the Taliban that were paying $4.50. So you always have to look for different ways of education and link it to relevance, whether it's in Jordan working with the Minister of Education and adding in secondary school, how do you deal with coding? How do you design a PowerPoint? How do you present? So it's not all about, there's so many opportunities to go into jobs straight from schooling. It's not all about formal schooling as the end all. So relevance has really featured prominently in my work and in my programs. The next point is monitoring and evaluation and learning from failures. Anna talked about this yesterday, and I think that it's so important when you're looking at learning from failures. I remember designing a trafficking program on the Thai-Myanmar border for girls, and we gave them English skills. And it was a success. So USAID was like, wow, what a great success. And then about a year later, we found that those girls were actually being trafficked for more money because they now had English skills. So making sure that you look and evaluate progress and define where success really lies is such a critical piece of what I have done in my policy work. Same thing with literacy. Everyone talks about, let's get that rural villager literate. 6 months later, after millions of dollars invested in literacy campaigns, rural populations revert to illiteracy, because they aren't going to start reading a newspaper just because they started a literacy campaign. So I've really, really pushed for functional literacy, agricultural literacy, and not simply reading, but reading. And just like yesterday, one of the presenters were talking about the importance of numeracy to start a business. The initiative that was mentioned, the leadership initiative, is something very new, and I'll spend just maybe 45 seconds on it. If you're interested, we can talk about it later. But it really is, it was me, in my experience of working with USAID and then moving to the UN and then moving back to academia. I met so many ministers, and I met many efforts of organizations building the pipeline of women leaders. But when women got to the leadership position, there were no networks for support and engagement. So I developed an initiative called Women's Leadership Initiative, targeting women cabinet ministers and looking for opportunities for women who have been there, done that, like our speaker from yesterday from Fiji, who would be the mentors, the role models for junior ministers. I met the minister from Saudi Arabia. There was only one female minister in 2005. Last year, they added 8 more ministers. So they need to have mentoring, they need to have support, they need to be able to share experiences. But the most important thing about this initiative really relates to my last point, and that relates to who supports gender agendas. It's not just women, it's men. Men are very often the strong advocates for programs and policies, and they should not be forgotten in terms of being advocates. And I'll just use this initiative as an example. I developed this 3 years ago when I left UNICEF and came back to UCLA to teach. And I identified the usual suspects for, in the US, there would be the ambassador for women's affairs at Washington, DC at State Department, the World Bank's head of gender, and USAID's gender, senior gender advisor. So I arranged for meetings, and during the meetings, they're very interested, but there was not one person who said, let's take this forward. And a friend of mine who was at the World Bank said, why don't we introduce you to this gentleman called Ajay? So I was like, okay. So I spent an hour with him, 2 hours with him, and he said, I love this initiative. I think that the World Bank should be pushing this forward. And it was not the gender advisor at the World Bank, it was this gentleman called Ajay, who was the one who said, let's push this forward. That is 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago to this date. Fast forward to Ajay introducing me to Vibke, who's with the German government. You'll hear from her this afternoon, who then I was introduced last year to a minister from Kuwait. And this past December, I wrote an email to Ajay. Ajay, do you know that 3 years ago, what you set off was just an amazing opportunity? And right here, I'm signing for this partnership to be launched with Kuwait. And Ajay said, oh, that's great. But you know, my mother, she coordinates this conference. It's called The Art of Living. You might be interested in participating. And he gave me, and the last part of his email, I'm sorry if I'm reading his email, I didn't ask for permission, but the last, he said, it might be a good platform to further your effort as it features and attracts successful women from all walks of life, sharing their lessons with each other. So here I am. I've learned much more than just from successful women, but from successful men, and just being here in this amazing ashram. And I would like to say also there's certain aspects of this. This is not just an experience of a professional or a policymaker, but an experience of being in a very spiritual, nourishing environment. I don't know how many of you enjoyed the happiness. That's why I'm so happy today. I was in the happiness program today, and I've taken the meditation program, and I know I've almost run out of time. I've probably run out of time, but I just want to say even things like the intuition program, when I see models like that, or the happiness program, South cooperation, South collaboration, I'm thinking even for the leadership initiative, for programs in San Francisco, bring those amazing leaders who are coming from right here and share those models and enrich our lives in the North, instead of us thinking that we are always coming to share our models with the South. Thank you so much.